And let's now jump into another action movie that actually is very similar to what works about John Wick. And it is a film that is also trying to model in on the success of John Wick. And I think it does so to varying degrees. And this film is called Sisu. This is directed by Jalmari Helander. This is, I want to say it is a Swedish film. Maybe it's Norway. But let me describe the plot. Deep into the wilderness of Lapland, a gold miner hits it rich only to stumble upon Nazis. Unfortunately for this Nazis, this gold miner has a few tricks up his sleeve. This is an action filler. This is an action film about a man with a dark past who's killed people, and now Nazis are trying to kill him, and he's going to kill all of them. And what works best about Sisu is that premise of a man brutally killing Nazis. If you're going to have an action film and you need to kind of horrifically kill people, human beings, make them Nazis. And it works to varying degrees of success throughout this film. And when I say varying, it's because this film is a little uneven at times. It has a tonal issue where sometimes it's a little bit too comedic. It's a bit too ridiculous. The character, the protagonist that we're following, he has too much plot armor where you just have to go with it. You just have to accept that this guy is kind of this immortal thing. He can't die even though he feels vulnerable, but he never actually shows any real signs of weakness. So you're left to believe that every time he gets hurt that you're supposed to feel his pain, but you also know he's going to get up. And that kind of adds this weird reaction when watching the movie because it has this weird like sense of fantasy mixed with trying to be a modern action movie like John Wick. The thing that works so well about John Wick is when Keanu Reeves breaks a bone in John Wick, you feel John Wick weaken the rest of the movie. When the character, the protagonist, I should say, of Sisu breaks a bone or anything like that, it kind of just feels like he moves right past it and there's no actual lasting impact on that. But the kills themselves are really entertaining. The film struggles to differentiate these kills where I do, when going back and thinking about this movie, I am left thinking like, you know what, that's kind of feels like the same kill from earlier. They all kind of just start blending together and it starts feeling weird for this to separate itself. So when I'm thinking back on this movie, I'm thinking this all just kind of blends together. And that's not necessarily in a bad way, but it does make it a little less memorable. Sisu has a very popish feel to it. I would compare this, and I hate using comparisons, but I think this is probably a pretty apt comparison, is similar to the style of Robert Rodriguez or Quentin Tarantino. Title cards / chapters literally, like quite literally appear on the screen. And it kind of makes it feel like a cartoon. It has this almost Looney Tunes-like energy to it when the title cards pop up, when we have these ridiculous kills, ridiculous explosions, all that. It feels very silly, but the actors all take the material deadly seriously. The actor who plays Sisu in particular, who I wish I had his name right here, and his name's actually Sisu. I believe it's actually Korpi. Sisu is a term kind of like the Baba Yaga in John Wick. It just basically means a killer. Something that cannot die, I think is described. But while the actors are taking this deadly seriously, it does again kind of create this tonal issue with it, where you're just kind of left thinking, where it's just like, this is too silly and yet it's too self-serious, and it just kind of lends itself to be somewhere in the middle. At times, this movie really reminded me of Jason Statham in the film Crank. And then at other times, this feels as deadly serious as a John Wick. And that tone doesn't mesh together perfectly at times. And it's an inexperienced director, and you can feel an inexperienced director at the helm. But what Helander, who is the director of this film, does really well is he utilizes this trick where we, of the audience, just kind of get to see what is coming in this movie. He's a very good visual cues director. Kind of the Chekhov's gun. There's certain weapons in this movie that are laid out, and you just know the character of Korpi will get his hands on it. And that's where the excitement is built up. Also, at like less than 90 minutes, this film just is in and out. Like I said, what the film does struggle with, though, is while that natural progression can be fun, some of it does feel very redundant and repetitive. And Helander has a really good eye for violence, but it's very sometimes not interesting. There's a few visceral kills, and then there's a lot of just really bloody kills that I kind of just don't have memory of. I can picture like the gun wounds going through, but they're not done in any particular interesting way. There doesn't feel like an impact. They're not cartoonish. They're just kind of there. And so again, it's this critique of an inexperienced director trying to accomplish something that he does, again, to largely successful degrees. But when this movie is so reliant on the action, because the character of Korpi barely speaks, it's almost a largely silent film for a majority of the time. When the action falls flat, the film can feel really flat. And in some cases, involving like bigger set pieces, like there's a set piece involving a tank, you can really feel the limitations of him as a director and also the limitations of a budget. And the film becomes static and thus loses some of that goodwill it has going on. There's also this subplot involving women, which I don't want to get too much into it, but it really does just empower the male revenge fantasy in a way that I just found a little bit more icky than, helpful? I don't know if that's the correct word, but I think it was supposed to be empowering, and I found it to be a little bit on the nose. And I felt like these characters weren't actually real characters. Now, this is not, again, while I did criticize this movie a fair amount, I think this film is worth your time. At like 85-minute runtime, if you are a fan of this type of movie, of this revenge thriller, of one man versus an army, it has that old school 80s throwback feel. And while it's not quite as successful as other films in the same genre, especially the film that I just reviewed in John Wick, it certainly has enough energy to it that I was left invested and I had a good time watching this movie, even if I can see some inherent flaws in the filmmaking. I'm giving Sisu 3.5 out of 5 stars.